My name is Daisy Sterling, and I am 24 years old. If you want to be an independent adult, you can pay for MIT yourself. Good luck surviving in Boston without my signature. You are nothing without us." Those were the exact words my father, Richard Sterling, typed into an email that effectively sabotaged my full-ride scholarship to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology 6 years ago. He didn't just withdraw his financial support. He contacted the admissions office to report a fraudulent discrepancy in my FAFSA that didn't exist, knowing the bureaucracy would freeze my enrollment until it was too late to register. He chose to destroy my future, not because of a grand betrayal, but because I wasn't home at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday to blend a organic blackberry and kale smoothie for my older sister's sensitive gums after a routine dental cleaning. My sister Clementine was 21 at the time, perfectly capable of using a Vitamix. But in the Sterling household, I was the utility, and she was the centerpiece. Today, I am the chief executive officer of Vanguard Private Equity, located on the 52nd floor of the One Vanderbilt skyscraper in Manhattan, overlooking the sprawling grid of a city that doesn't care about my father's temper. 6 years ago, my parents, Richard and Elena Sterling, skipped my college signing day to take Clementine for a plaque scraping and a spa afternoon. Today, they have been sitting in my mahogany-paneled waiting room for 3 hours, clutching lukewarm espresso from the Starbucks downstairs, begging for a $12.5 million bailout to keep Clementine out of federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the cold satisfaction of watching my father's hands shake as he holds a manila folder in my lobby, you have to understand the house on Shoreline Drive in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was a 6-bedroom colonial worth $4.2 million, filled with expensive restoration hardware furniture and the constant, suffocating scent of diptyque feu de bois candles. My father was a senior partner at a mid-tier accounting firm, earning a base salary of $480,000 a year, yet he treated every cent like a weapon. Clementine was the golden child, a fragile beauty who dropped out of 3 different liberal arts colleges because the dorm mattresses were too firm or the professors were too demanding. My parents didn't mind. They bought her a 2018 Range Rover Sport in Fuji White the moment she turned 16 and opened a discretionary credit card for her that saw monthly charges of $5,000 at Bloomingdale's and Saks Fifth Avenue. Meanwhile, I was the ghost in the attic. I worked 30 hours a week at a local library while maintaining a 4.5 weighted GPA, saving every penny from my $15 an hour paycheck to buy a second-hand 2012 Honda Civic with a dented fender and a transmission that groaned every time I hit 60 miles per hour. The night of the smoothie incident remains etched in my mind with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. It was June 14, 2019. I was at the public library finishing a shift when my phone erupted with 17 missed calls and a string of increasingly vitriolic text messages. Clementine's gums were sore. She was crying. Why wasn't I there to prep her recovery meal? When I walked through the heavy oak front door at 5:30 p.m., the atmosphere was combustible. My father didn't yell at first. He stood in the kitchen, his face a terrifying shade of puce, holding his iPhone 11 Pro like a dagger. He told me that my selfishness had reached its limit. He told me that if I thought I was too good for this family because of a Cambridge acceptance letter, I could see how far my intellect got me without his social security number on my financial aid forms. By midnight, the email to MIT was sent. By the following Monday, my housing was revoked, and my dreams of becoming a quantitative analyst were seemingly incinerated. I didn't cry in front of them. I packed my duffel bags, threw my thrift store clothes into the back of my rattling Honda Civic, and drove toward Boston with exactly $1,200 in my savings account. I spent the next 3 years working 2 full-time jobs, one as a night shift data entry clerk for a logistics firm in Chelsea, and another as a junior bookkeeper for a construction company. I slept 4 hours a day on a twin mattress I found on the curb in Allston, eating 99-cent cans of generic tuna and drinking tap water to keep my expenses under $900 a month. I didn't go to MIT. I went to the University of Massachusetts, Boston, taking night classes and grinding through a finance degree with a ferocity that scared my peers. While Clementine was posting photos from a yacht in Saint-Tropez, funded by my father's dwindling retirement fund, I was learning how to dismantle corporate balance sheets and identify the exact moment a company becomes vulnerable to a hostile takeover. My parents blocked my number the day I left. They didn't want to hear from the ungrateful daughter who chose her ego over her sister's comfort. They missed my graduation, where I stood alone in a sea of families, clutching a degree that I had bled for. They weren't there when I landed a junior analyst role at a boutique firm on Wall Street, starting at $95,000 a year, plus a performance bonus that I immediately invested into high-yield tech stocks. They weren't there when I moved into a luxury apartment in Long Island City, paying $4,200 a month for a view of the skyline that used to haunt my dreams. My rise was silent, calculated, and entirely fueled by the memory of that blackberry smoothie. 3 years ago, I founded Vanguard Private Equity with 2 partners I met during a high-stakes merger. We specialized in distressed assets and aggressive restructuring. By the time I turned 23, my personal net worth had eclipsed the total value of my father's entire estate. I owned a 2024 Midnight Emerald Bentley Bentayga and wore custom-tailored power suits from Savile Row that cost more than my father's first car. I had become the very personification of the independence he said would destroy me. And all the while, the Sterling family was rotting from the inside out. Clementine, in her infinite wisdom, had decided to launch a luxury lifestyle brand called Solstice. She convinced my father to mortgage the Greenwich house to the hilt and liquidate his 401k to provide a $10 million seed investment. But Clementine didn't understand supply chains or fiduciary responsibility. She understood aesthetics and vanity. To keep the brand afloat while she lived a billionaire lifestyle on a millionaire's budget, she began shuffling funds between shell companies, forging signatures on loan applications, and eventually dipping into the escrow accounts of my father's few remaining high-net-worth clients. The house of cards collapsed 3 weeks ago when the FBI raided their Greenwich home at 6 a.m. I saw the news on my Bloomberg terminal before the first cup of coffee had even reached my desk. Clementine was facing 14 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. My father was facing professional disbarment and a civil suit that would leave him in a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood for the rest of his life. They needed $12.5 million for the legal defense and the immediate restitution to avoid the harshest sentencing guidelines. They had nowhere left to turn. Every bridge my father had built in the accounting world was charred to ash by the scandal. Every relative they had boasted to for decades had suddenly lost their phone. And so, they came to Manhattan. They didn't call. They couldn't. I had changed my number 6 times since 2019. They simply showed up at the Vanguard reception desk, looking 10 years older and 100 pounds heavier with the weight of their own failures. My assistant, a sharp woman named Marcus, who I pay $200,000 a year to keep my life seamless, buzzed my private line. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling are here to see you, Daisy. They say it's a family emergency." I looked at the security feed on my second monitor. My father was wearing a suit that was frayed at the cuffs, a stark contrast to the $12,000 Armani he used to preen in. My mother was weeping into a designer scarf that was 3 seasons out of style. I didn't let them in immediately. I made them wait while I finished a conference call regarding a $40 million acquisition in the renewable energy sector. I let them sit in the silence of my success, surrounded by the awards and the glass-enclosed views of a city they told me I'd never survive in. When I finally walked out into the lobby, I didn't greet them with a hug or a tear. I didn't even sit down. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the afternoon sun reflecting off my Patek Philippe Nautilus watch, and looked at the man who had tried to bury me. His eyes were bloodshot, and his voice was a raspy shadow of the roar it used to be. "Daisy," he started, his hands trembling as he reached for that manila folder. "We made mistakes." "Your sister? She's young. She didn't know what she was doing. We need help. We need $12.5 million by Friday or the prosecutors won't offer the plea deal." I looked at my mother, who couldn't even meet my gaze. She was the one who had watched him send that email to MIT and had merely asked if I wanted to take my laundry with me before I left. I remembered the coldness of that kitchen, the smell of the blended blackberries, and the sound of my father's laughter when he said I was nothing. I took the folder from his hands, not to read it, but to feel the weight of their desperation. It felt light. It felt insignificant compared to the weight of the 3 jobs I worked to put myself through school. I looked my father in the eye, the same way I look at a CEO during a hostile takeover, and I didn't see a father. I saw a bad investment. I saw a man who had gambled his daughter's future for a smoothie and lost everything in the process. The silence in the lobby was absolute, broken only by the distant hum of the ventilation system and the muffled sirens of the city 52 floors below. I thought about the $12.5 million. To me, it was a rounding error on a quarterly report. To them, it was the difference between a life of dignity and a life of ruin. But dignity is something you earn, not something you buy with a bailout from the child you discarded. My father's breath hitched, waiting for me to say the word yes, waiting for me to be the daughter he never was a father to. But the Sterling family didn't value blood, they valued utility. And right now, their utility was 0. Family isn't the people who share your DNA while treating you like a burden to be managed. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, the people who build you up when the world tries to tear you down. My father had taught me that I was nothing without him. But he was wrong. He was the nothingness. And I was the one who had filled the void with a life he could no longer even imagine. The Sterling household, situated on a meticulously manicured 3-acre lot in the affluent suburb of Barrington, Illinois, functioned less like a family home and more like a sacred temple dedicated to the singular worship of one person, which was my older sister, Harper. While our neighbors in the northwest suburbs of Chicago were busy maintaining their own versions of the American dream, my parents were preoccupied with the aggressive cultivation of Harper's social standing at the direct expense of my own basic existence. At 22 years old, Harper was the undisputed sun around which the entire Sterling galaxy rotated, evidenced by the 2024 Santorini Black Range Rover HSE parked prominently in the circular aggregate driveway, a $95,000 machine that she treated with the careless indifference of a toy. Her life was a choreographed sequence of leisure and aesthetic perfection, supported by a $4,500 monthly allowance that my father deposited into her Chase Sapphire checking account every 30 days without fail, ostensibly for the purpose of networking at high-end brunch spots like Beatrix or the Hampton Social. In the eyes of our mother, Susan, every avocado toast Harper photographed for her Instagram was a strategic move toward a vaguely defined future of greatness, despite the fact that Harper was currently limping through a communications degree at a private college with a lackluster C average that suggested she spent more time selecting filters than studying semiotics. I was the ghost in the attic, the silent daughter whose presence was only acknowledged when there was a chore to be completed or a shadow to be cast, so that Harper could appear brighter by comparison. While my sister slept until 11 in the morning on her $1,500 Tempur-Pedic mattress, I was awake at 5, preparing for a day that required me to be a student, a laborer, and a servant all at once. To afford the barest essentials of a life my parents refused to fund, I worked 30 hours a week as a private tutor for middle schoolers in the neighboring district, earning $25 an hour to explain the nuances of algebraic equations to children whose parents actually valued education. Every cent of those earnings was spoken for before it even hit my hand. I spent months saving $500 just to buy a durable North Face winter parka that could withstand the brutal Chicago wind chills and a $400 refurbished MacBook Air from 2020 so that I could actually complete my own university assignments. The contrast was a constant, dull ache in my chest, a physical manifestation of the deep-seated inequality that defined our domestic life. The financial disparity was not a matter of necessity, but a deliberate choice of valuation made by Susan and Richard Sterling, who saw me as a sunk cost and Harper as a blue-chip stock that was bound to soar. I remember a specific Tuesday in October when the temperature had plummeted to a damp 40 degrees, and I watched through the window as my mother drove Harper to an appointment at a boutique salon in Gold Coast for a full head of hand-painted highlights that cost $1,200, not including the generous tip. At that exact moment, I was standing on my knees in the foyer, my hands red and raw from being submerged in a bucket of hot water mixed with concentrated bleach and ammonia. My task for the afternoon was to scrub every inch of the grout between the white Carrara marble tiles in the grand entryway, a job Susan insisted I do by hand with a stiff bristled toothbrush because she claimed the professional steam cleaners we used to hire were too abrasive for the stone. I was the unpaid maid, the internal maintenance crew for a museum dedicated to a sister who wouldn't even know how to hold a mop, let alone use one. The scent of the cleaning chemicals would seep into my skin and linger in my hair for days, a permanent reminder of my rank in the Sterling hierarchy, while Harper would return home smelling of Oral-B hairspray and expensive Santal 33 perfume. She would glide across the floors I had just polished, her $400 leather mules clicking against the marble, often leaving a trail of discarded shopping bags from Nordstrom or Neiman Marcus in her wake. She was the golden investment that never paid a dividend, a black hole of resources that my parents fed with a desperate, almost religious fervor. Whenever I dared to ask why I had to pay for my own textbooks, while Harper was gifted a $3,000 Chanel handbag for simply making it to her Friday morning seminar, Susan would look at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if my very existence was an interruption to the harmony of the house. She would tell me that I was the strong one, the independent one, and that Harper needed the extra support because she was more sensitive to the pressures of the world. It was a convenient narrative that allowed them to ignore the fact that they were systematically dismantling my self-worth to build a pedestal for a girl who didn't even care enough to learn my birthday. Living in that house was an exercise in hypervigilance, where I learned to navigate the corridors of our $4 million colonial without making a sound, hoping to avoid a new list of demands from my father or a critique of my appearance from my mother. Richard Sterling was a man who valued optics above all else, a senior executive at a global consulting firm who expected his home to be a reflection of his professional success, which meant a daughter like me, with my tired eyes and my thrift store sweaters, was a flaw in the presentation. He would sit in his leather-bound study, sipping a 20-year-old Macallan Scotch that cost more per bottle than my entire monthly grocery budget, and lecture me on the importance of fiscal responsibility whenever I asked for help with a $200 lab fee for my chemistry course. He told me that struggling built character, yet he shielded Harper from even the slightest gust of reality, ensuring that her Range Rover was always fueled with premium gas on his corporate card and that her credit card debt was wiped clean at the end of every fiscal quarter. The injustice was so thick you could almost see it, like the Lake Michigan fog that rolled over the suburbs in the early morning. I spent my nights in my small room at the end of the hallway, the only room in the house that hadn't been renovated with custom cabinetry or designer wallpaper, surrounded by the hum of my refurbished laptop and the stacks of library books that were my only escape. I would hear the muffled sounds of laughter from downstairs, the clinking of wine glasses and the upbeat chatter of a family that seemed perfectly complete without me. They would discuss Harper's potential career in public relations or her upcoming trip to Tulum, while I sat under a 60-watt bulb calculating how many more hours of tutoring I would need to work to afford the train fare into the city for my internship. I was the engine that kept the house clean and the background noise that made their lives feel substantial, but I was never a member of the elite club that bore my own last name. I became an expert in the silent arts, learning how to mend the seams of my own clothes so I didn't have to ask for money for new ones, and how to cook basic meals from the back of the pantry that Susan had forgotten were there. I watched as Harper received a $20,000 Rolex for her graduation from a program she barely finished, while my own academic achievements, the Dean's List honors and the prestigious research assistantship, were met with a curt nod and a reminder that the guest bathroom needed a fresh coat of sealant. The Sterling household was a masterclass in the weaponization of affection, where love was a currency that was heavily devalued for me and hyperinflated for the daughter who did nothing to earn it. They were building a queen out of a girl with the depth of a puddle, and in the process, they were trying to turn me into the dirt she walked on. But what they didn't realize was that while I was scrubbing their floors and tutoring their neighbors' children, I was also observing the cracks in their foundation. I was learning the exact cost of their vanity, the way my father's hands shook when he checked the market updates on his Bloomberg terminal, and the way my mother hid the department store bills in the bottom of the recycling bin. I was absorbing the technical details of their world, the brands they used to signal their status, and the exact prices they paid for their illusions. I knew that the $1,500 designer chairs in the dining room were uncomfortable, and that the $300 silk pillowcases Harper insisted on were constantly stained with the expensive night cream she never washed off properly. I saw the reality behind the hyper-real facade they presented to the world, and I realized that their power was entirely dependent on my willingness to stay in the shadows. Every time I pressed my weight into the grout brush, every time I carried Harper's heavy leather suitcases up the stairs after another one of her expensive retreats, I was fueling a quiet, cold fire within myself. I wasn't just working to survive, I was working to outpace them. I was building a life of substance in the dark, using the very tools of discipline and grit that they had forced upon me as a punishment. My father's words, that I was nothing without them, became the primary motivation for every decision I made. I wanted to be so far removed from the Sterling Temple that I wouldn't even be able to smell the incense they burned for Harper. I wanted to reach a point where my success was not just a rebuttal to their neglect, but a complete and total eclipse of their existence. I was the ghost in the attic, yes, but ghosts have a way of outlasting the people who try to haunt them, and I was preparing for the day when I would step out of the shadows and show them exactly what the daughter they discarded was capable of becoming. Family isn't the people who make you work for the love they give others for free. Family is the bridge you build for yourself when the people who were supposed to carry you decide to let you fall. The definitive breaking point of my life did not occur during a screaming match or a grand confrontation in the marble-floored foyer of our Barrington estate, but rather in the hollow, echoing silence of the West Bridge High School gymnasium on National Signing Day. It was a crisp Wednesday morning in early February, the kind of day where the Chicago wind rattles the industrial window frames of old buildings, and I was seated at a long folding table draped in a generic navy blue tablecloth that smelled faintly of industrial detergent and old gym floor wax. In front of me sat a single lonely crimson pennant bearing the silver logo of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a symbol of a future I had built with my own sweat, late nights, and the meager earnings from my tutoring shifts. To my left and right, two black plastic folding chairs remained pointedly, agonizingly empty, each one marked with a crisp white sheet of paper that read, "Reserved, Family" in bold Times New Roman font. I had spent the previous evening ironing my only professional blouse, a modest cream-colored silk piece I'd found for $12 at a consignment shop in Libertyville, and I had foolishly hoped that perhaps, just this once, the magnitude of my achievement would outweigh the trivial whims of my sister's pampered existence. The gym was filled with the low hum of hundreds of students, faculty members, and proud parents who had brought balloons, professional cameras, and bouquets of flowers from the local florist on Main Street to celebrate their children's athletic and academic commitments. Principal Holloway stood at the mahogany lectern, his voice booming over the PA system as he began the ceremony, and when he finally announced my name as the first student in the history of the entire school district to receive a full-ride scholarship for the predictive analytics program at MIT, the applause was thunderous. It was a moment that should have been the pinnacle of my young life, a validation of every hour I spent scrubbing grout and every night I spent staring at complex algorithms on my refurbished $400 laptop until my eyes burned. But as the principal gestured toward my empty cheering section, expecting to see a beaming mother and a proud father, I felt the weight of the silence in those two empty chairs pressing down on me like a physical burden. I felt the eyes of the other parents on me, their expressions shifting from admiration to a stinging, misplaced pity that made the bile rise in my throat. While the other students were leaning into their parents for photographs and holding oversized pens for the local newspapers, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out my iPhone SE. Its screen cracked at the corner from a drop 3 months prior that I couldn't afford to repair. I opened Instagram, my thumb trembling slightly as the feed refreshed, and at exactly 10:14 a.m., while I was being hailed as a district prodigy, my mother, Susan Sterling, had posted a high-resolution selfie from the waiting room of a high-end cosmetic dentist's office in the Gold Coast of Chicago. The image showed her sitting in a plush velvet armchair, a flute of cucumber-infused water in her hand, while Harper pouted in the background with a designer bib draped over her $1,200 cashmere sweater. The caption was a masterclass in passive-aggressive erasure, reading, "Routine cleanings can be so scary for my sensitive girl, but I'd never dream of leaving my golden girl's side during such a stressful morning," accompanied by the hashtag #FamilyFirst. The irony was a jagged blade. They were 5 miles away, ignoring a historic milestone to provide moral support for a dental cleaning that Clementine hadn't even needed, choosing to prioritize a plaque scraping over the daughter who was literally making history. The silence in that gym cost more than any 4-year tuition at an Ivy League institution ever could, because it was the sound of a final, irreversible divorce from the people who had brought me into the world. I didn't cry, because tears require a belief that things might still change, and I had finally reached the absolute floor of my expectations for them. I looked at the legal documents sitting on the table, the papers that would bind me to a prestigious future in Cambridge and provide the escape hatch I had been building since I was 10 years old. I picked up the heavy, silver-plated pen the school provided for the occasion, feeling the cold metal against my calloused palm, and I signed my name with a steady, deliberate hand that did not betray the earthquake happening inside my soul. In that moment, as the ink dried on the contract that ensured I would never have to ask Richard Sterling for a single penny, I realized with a chilling, clinical clarity that I was effectively an orphan with living parents. I was a girl without a tribe, a ghost who had finally decided to stop haunting the house that refused to see her, and as I stood up to shake the principal's hand, I felt the last threads of my filial obligation snap like overextended piano wire. The walk back to my locker was a blur of fluorescent lights and muffled congratulations from teachers who didn't understand that they were witnessing a funeral for my relationship with my family. I went home that afternoon to an empty house, the Range Rover still absent from the driveway, and I didn't wait for them to return so I could explain why I was hurt or show them the certificate of my achievement. I went straight to the laundry room, grabbed the industrial-sized bottle of bleach, and finished the task my mother had assigned me that morning before she left for the dentist, cleaning the mud-caked floor mats from Harper's car. I did it with a robotic efficiency, my mind already miles away in a dorm room I hadn't seen yet, calculating the exact number of hours I would need to work over the summer to afford a one-way Greyhound ticket to Boston. When Susan and Harper finally strolled through the door at 4 p.m., laughing about the expensive lunch they'd shared at a bistro on Michigan Avenue, they didn't even ask how the signing went. My mother simply glanced at the clean floor mats and told me I'd missed a spot near the corner before asking if I could start the laundry for Harper's gym clothes. I realized then that my survival depended on my invisibility, and that every detail of my life from that point forward had to be a secret kept from the people who only saw me as a convenience. They didn't know that I had already spent 6 months studying the financial portfolios of the firms I wanted to intern for, or that I had memorized the exact market value of every piece of jewelry in my mother's mahogany armoire just in case I ever needed to know the true worth of their vanity. I watched them live their hyper-real, branded lives, obsessed with the $25 salads they ordered for lunch and the $400 hair appointments they scheduled every 6 weeks, and I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was a predator in their midst, a girl who had been forged in the cold fire of their neglect, learning how to count every cent and measure every risk while they floated in a bubble of unearned luxury. My name was Daisy Sterling, And while they saw a maid, I saw a future CEO who was currently learning exactly how to dismantle an empire built on nothing but aesthetic lies and misplaced favoritism. The technical precision of my plan was my only solace. I knew that MIT's financial aid office would require my father's signature on a series of documents to finalize the transition of my full-ride status, and I knew with a sickening certainty that he would use that power as a leash the moment he realized I was actually leaving. I spent my nights in the attic, the small space smelling of old wood and the cheap lavender detergent I used for my thrift store clothes, documenting every interaction and every instance of financial disparity in a small black notebook I kept hidden under a loose floorboard. I tracked the $900 monthly payments for Harper's car insurance and the $12,000 they spent on her debutante ball, contrasting it with the $0 they contributed to my college applications or my basic medical needs. I was building a case for my own independence, a ledger of their failures that I would one day use to balance the scales of my own life. That night, as I sat on my twin mattress and listened to the sounds of my parents watching a movie in their high-end home theater downstairs, the deep bass of the $4,000 sound system vibrating through the floorboards, I didn't feel the envy I used to feel. I felt a cold, analytical resolve that was far more powerful than anger. I thought about the $12.5 million my father would eventually beg me for, and I realized that the price of my soul was significantly higher than the price of his survival. Family isn't the people who sign a birth certificate or the people who live under the same roof while ignoring your heart's desire. Family is the bridge of trust you build with those who recognize your worth when you have nothing to offer but your potential. My parents had treated me like a line item to be minimized, a cost-saving measure in the budget of their golden daughter's life, but they had failed to realize that I was the only asset in the sterling portfolio that actually had any long-term value. As the winter moon hung over the quiet, affluent streets of Barrington, I fell asleep knowing that I was no longer a sterling in anything but name, and that the silence of that gymnasium was the most honest thing my parents had ever given me. At 3:14 a.m. on that cold February night, the silence of the Sterling estate was so absolute that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the $20,000 grandfather clock in the foyer echoing all the way up to my attic room. I didn't sit down to write a long, emotional letter filled with the grievances I had accumulated over 18 years, because I realized that a letter would imply I still cared enough to want them to understand my pain. Instead, I left a resignation from a job I had never applied for but had been forced to perform every single day of my life. I stood in the darkened kitchen, illuminated only by the blue LED glow of the high-end Sub-Zero refrigerator, and I placed my house key, which was nothing more than a $3 piece of stamped brass, directly in the center of the $25,000 Italian Carrara marble kitchen island. That island had been the stage for so many of my family's performances of perfection, yet its cold, white surface felt like a tombstone for the girl I used to be. I didn't need a grand gesture or a final screaming match to punctuate my exit, because the people sleeping in the primary suites upstairs had already checked out of my life years ago, leaving me to handle the logistics of my own departure. I had packed everything I truly owned into a single $40 canvas duffel bag I had purchased with my own tutoring money from a Target in Hoffman Estates, its zipper catching slightly as I stuffed in my few pairs of thrift store jeans and the cream-colored silk blouse I had worn to my signing ceremony. There was no drama, no slamming of doors, and no cinematic confrontation, because the Sterling household didn't do confrontation. We did coldness and calculated indifference. I moved through the house like a shadow, carefully avoiding the floorboards I knew would creak under the weight of my footsteps, my heart hammering against my ribs not out of fear, but out of a desperate, clawing need for the fresh air of the world outside. I climbed into my 2012 Honda Civic, the engine turning over with a familiar groaning protest that seemed to scream into the quiet suburban night. And I drove away from the $4 million Colonial without once looking back in the rearview mirror. I had spent my life maintaining their museum, and now I was finally leaving it to gather the dust it deserved. I moved into the spare room of my high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Gable, a woman who had seen the bruises on my spirit long before I had the words to describe them. Her house was a modest ranch-style home in a part of town my father would have called a transitional neighborhood. But to me, the scent of old books and cinnamon tea felt more like a palace than the Sterling estate ever had. I spent the remainder of the night sitting on the edge of a twin bed that didn't have a designer headboard, watching the sunrise over the rooftops and waiting for the inevitable moment when my absence would finally be noticed. I knew it wouldn't be because they missed my face or my voice, but because the machinery of their daily comfort would grind to a halt without its unpaid operator. I checked my phone periodically, the cracked screen reflecting the morning light, but the silence from my family persisted well into the late morning, proving that as long as the coffee was made and the laundry was moving, the ghost in the attic was irrelevant. When my mother, Susan Sterling, finally sent a text message at exactly 11 a.m. the next day, it wasn't a frantic inquiry about my whereabouts or an apology for missing the most important day of my academic career. The notification popped up on my screen while I was helping Mrs. Gable organize a stack of college application folders, and the words were so predictably cruel that I almost laughed at the sheer consistency of her neglect. The text read, "Harper's gums are still incredibly sensitive after yesterday, and she is in a terrible mood because the Wi-Fi in her room is acting up again. Come downstairs right now to make her a blackberry and kale smoothie, and please make sure to deep clean the counters after you are done, because there were water spots on the marble this morning." There was no greeting, no concern, just a list of demands for the servant she thought was still under her roof. She didn't realize that the girl who scrubbed the grout and polished the silver had died in that gymnasium the day before, replaced by a woman who was already calculating the logistics of a life she would build entirely on her own terms. I stared at the message for a long time, the blinking cursor on my phone feeling like a countdown to a new era. I thought about the thousands of smoothies I had blended for Harper, the hundreds of hours I had spent ensuring their lives were seamless while mine was fraying at every edge, and the way they had prioritized a routine dental cleaning over my full-ride scholarship to MIT. I felt a cold, sharp sense of relief wash over me, a feeling of absolute autonomy that I had never experienced in the house on Shoreline Drive. I didn't type out a paragraph explaining my hurt or a list of the ways they had failed me, because I knew that in the Sterling world, emotions were just another form of weakness to be exploited. I replied with exactly 3 words that carried the weight of a 1,000-page manifesto. I moved out. I hit send and watched the little blue bubble disappear into the digital ether, knowing that it would trigger a frantic search for the house key I had left sitting on that expensive marble island. The response was not immediate, which told me everything I needed to know about how little they actually valued my communication. They probably spent the next 20 minutes calling for me from the bottom of the stairs, getting increasingly agitated that their demands weren't being met, before my father finally went up to the attic to drag me down by the arm. I could imagine his face turning that familiar shade of puce when he found the room empty, the bed made with the precision I had been trained to provide, and the closet stripped of everything but the designer hangers they had bought for the clothes they never bothered to buy me. My mother would be in the kitchen, staring at that $3 brass key on the $25,000 island, realizing that the utility she had relied on for 18 years had finally opted out of the contract. The realization wouldn't be one of heartbreak, but of massive inconvenience, a logistical nightmare that would require them to actually interact with the dirt and the details of their own existence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one who had to fix the problem. I wasn't the one who had to apologize for a tone of voice I didn't use or a chore I hadn't finished to their impossible standards. I sat in Mrs. Gable's quiet kitchen, drinking a cup of coffee from a mismatched ceramic mug that cost $2 at a garage sale, and I felt more powerful than I ever had in my father's mahogany-paneled study. I began to map out my next 6 months with the technical precision of a corporate takeover, calculating the exact amount of money I would need to save from my tutoring job to cover the gap between my scholarship and the cost of living in Cambridge. I researched the cheapest grocery stores in the Boston area, the most reliable bus routes from the airport to campus, and the names of the professors whose research in predictive analytics would eventually become the foundation of my career at Vanguard Private Equity. Every detail I gathered was a brick in the wall I was building between myself and the Sterlings, a wall they would eventually spend $12.5 million trying to climb. The silence that followed my 3-word text was the most honest conversation we had ever had. It was the sound of them realizing that their golden girl, Harper, would now have to learn how to operate the Vitamix herself, and that Susan would have to find a new person to scrub the water spots off the marble. They didn't call to ask where I was staying or if I had enough to eat. They didn't even try to track my phone, likely because they didn't want to deal with the reality of where I had gone. I was a ghost who had finally stopped haunting them, and they were more than happy to let the memory of my service fade, as long as it didn't disrupt their brunch schedule. I spent that afternoon looking out at the modest neighborhood of West Bridge, realizing that I was no longer a Sterling in the way that mattered. I was a person who owned a $40 duffel bag and a 3.7 GPA, and for the first time, those things were enough. I understood then that family isn't the people who demand your labor while ignoring your soul. Family is the person who opens their spare room and doesn't ask for a receipt. My father had once told me that I was nothing without the Sterling name, but as I sat in the sun-drenched kitchen of a woman who actually saw me, I realized that the Sterling name was the only thing holding me back. I was the one who had built the discipline, the one who had mastered the math, and the one who had maintained the temple while the priests were busy worshiping a false idol in a Range Rover. I was the only thing of value in that house, and I had taken that value with me when I walked out the door at 3:14 a.m. The $12.5 million they would eventually need was just a future price tag on the neglect they were currently practicing. I looked at the 3 words on my phone screen. I moved out, and I felt the weight of my future beginning to settle into a solid, unshakable foundation. That evening, as I helped Mrs. Gable prepare a simple dinner of pasta and jarred sauce, the contrast between my old life and my new one was staggering. There was no tension in the air, no fear of saying the wrong thing, and no expectation that I would have to earn my place at the table by scrubbing the floors afterward. We talked about the predictive analytics program at MIT, about the books I wanted to read over the summer, and about the sheer, terrifying brilliance of a world that didn't belong to Richard and Susan Sterling. I realized that the hyper-real world of brand names and marble islands was a prison, and that I had finally found the key to my own cell, even if it was just a $3 piece of brass left on a kitchen counter. The road to Manhattan was long and filled with the grit of real life, but as I fell asleep that night in a room that actually belonged to me, I knew that I would never again be the ghost in someone else's attic. I was Daisy Sterling, and I was finally, irrevocably, my own person. My father, Richard Sterling, did not react to my departure with the somber reflection of a parent who had realized he'd pushed his child too far. Instead, he reacted with the cold, calculated aggression of a cornered predator whose primary source of free labor had just escaped the cage. He didn't mourn the loss of his daughter or the empty bedroom in the attic that now sat silent and stripped of my presence, but rather, he immediately launched a systematic attack on the very foundations of the independence I had worked so hard to build in the shadows. His first move was an attempt to execute a financial decapitation by trying to drain my primary savings account, which held exactly $5,120, every single cent I had earned over 3 years of tutoring middle schoolers in algebra and chemistry at $25 an hour. He walked into the local branch of Chase Bank in Barrington with the confidence of a man who believed his name on a joint account was a deed of ownership over my life. But he was met with a technicality that I had prepared for with the precision of a clockmaker. At 12:01 a.m. on the morning of my 18th birthday, while the rest of the house was asleep and dreaming of Harper's next designer handbag, I had sat at my refurbished laptop and transferred every penny into a private, high-yield savings account at an online-only bank that he didn't even know existed. When the teller informed him that the balance was zero and that he no longer had authorization to view the transaction history, his fury wasn't born of a need for the money, as his own salary was nearly $500,000 a year, but from the realization that he had lost his first point of leverage. When the financial drain failed, Richard Sterling decided to launch what he considered to be his nuclear strike against my future at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a move so malicious it effectively sought to orphan my scholarship and leave me stranded without a path forward. He knew that the FAFSA process required a parent's tax verification forms and a signed master promissory note to finalize the release of my full-ride predictive analytics scholarship, and he simply refused to provide them, explicitly telling me in a brief, venomous email that he would not support a child who had abandoned her family for the sake of her own ego. He thought he had trapped me in a bureaucratic nightmare from which there was no escape, believing that without his signature, the university would have no choice but to rescind my admission and my funding, forcing me to crawl back to the house on Shoreline Drive to resume my role as Harper's maid. He didn't realize that while he was busy playing golf at the country club and complaining about my ungratefulness, I was sitting in the back of a public library with a pro bono legal advocate I had found through a local youth advocacy center, filing the paperwork for an emergency legal emancipation and a dependency override. I spent the next 72 hours in a feverish state of hyper-focus, gathering every receipt for my own winter coats, every record of my tutoring income, and every saved text message from my mother demanding I clean the grout while Harper went to the spa, building a mountain of evidence that proved I was functionally independent and emotionally neglected. The battle for my education was fought in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of the school district and the local courthouse, where I presented my case with a clinical detachment that seemed to stun the administrators who were used to seeing teenagers in tears. By the time the dust settled, the financial aid office at MIT had granted me a rare emergency dependency override, which meant I was no longer classified as a dependent of Richard and Elena Sterling, but as an independent adult in the eyes of the federal government. This didn't just save my admission. It transformed my financial package into a $62,000 a year grant that covered not only my tuition, but also my housing and a modest living stipend, a sum of money that my father could never touch, influence, or hold over my head ever again. I left for Boston in my rattling 2012 Honda Civic, my $40 duffel bag in the trunk, and a sense of victory so cold and sharp that it felt like a physical weight in my chest. I didn't send a goodbye text, and I didn't check the mail for a letter of apology that I knew would never come, because I was too busy calculating the exact cost of the groceries I would need to survive on a $40 a week budget for the next 4 years. Living in Boston was a lesson in the absolute limits of human endurance and the terrifying power of a focused mind, as I balanced the most rigorous academic curriculum in the world with the reality of having no safety net other than the one I had woven myself. I lived in a cramped, 400-square-foot apartment in East Cambridge that I shared with 3 other girls, sleeping on a mattress that was essentially a pile of blankets on the floor because I couldn't justify the cost of a bed frame. My life was a cycle of hyper-realistic frugality where every cent was accounted for. I knew that a pound of generic dried lentils cost $1.29 at the discount grocer and could provide 4 meals if I was careful with the portions. I didn't go to the bars on Lansdowne Street, and I didn't buy the expensive tech gear that my classmates' parents were shipping to their dorms by the crate load. Instead, I stayed in the computer labs until 3 in the morning, fueled by black coffee from the 25-cent vending machine and a simmering, unshakable rage. While Harper was likely spending her weekends at brunch in Chicago, complaining about the wait time for a table at some trendy new restaurant, I was teaching myself the intricacies of neural networks and stochastic modeling on a machine that was barely holding together with tape and sheer willpower. The predictive algorithm that would eventually become the cornerstone of Vanguard private equity started as a side project during my sophomore year, a complex mathematical architecture designed to identify undervalued corporate assets by analyzing subtle patterns in public financial disclosures and social sentiment data. I treated the code like a living thing, refining the logic and testing the parameters against historical market crashes with a level of obsession that made my professors take notice. I wasn't just doing it for the grades, I was doing it because I knew that in the world my father lived in, information was the only currency that truly mattered, and I wanted to own the mint. I spent 4 years building a fortress out of data, transforming the pain of being discarded by my own parents into a tool that could dismantle the very types of firms my father had spent his life serving. Every time my stomach growled from a dinner that consisted of nothing but white rice and soy sauce, I added another layer of complexity to the algorithm, ensuring that when I finally released it, it would be undeniable and unstoppable. The day I sold the initial beta version of that algorithm to a boutique hedge fund in the Seaport District for $8.4 million was the day I officially stopped being a sterling and started being an institution. I remember sitting in a glass-walled conference room overlooking the harbor, wearing a $300 suit I had bought with my first paycheck from a summer internship, and watching the partners nod in silent appreciation as the data visualizations danced across the screen. They didn't see the girl who had scrubbed the grout in a Barrington mansion or the ghost who had slept in an attic. They saw a visionary who had cracked a code they didn't even know was broken. I signed the contract with the same steady hand I had used on National Signing Day, but this time, the stakes were personal in a way they couldn't possibly understand. The money hit my account that afternoon, a staggering sum that made the $5,000 my father had tried to steal look like pocket change. I didn't buy a mansion or a fleet of cars. I took that $8.4 million and used it as the seed capital for Vanguard, hiring the best legal minds and analysts money could buy to ensure that I would never be vulnerable to a man like Richard Sterling ever again. By the time I was 22, I had achieved a level of financial security that most people don't see in 3 lifetimes. Yet I still found myself checking the price of milk and weighing the cost of a subway fare against the time it took to walk. The habits of my survival had become the architecture of my success, a hyper-realistic understanding of the world where every asset has a price and every person has a breaking point. I had become the personification of the independence my father warned me would be my ruin. But instead of being destroyed by the world, I had learned how to predict its movements. I had built a life that was entirely my own, a sprawling empire of private equity that operated with the same cold, analytical precision I had used to survive on $40 a week in Boston. I was no longer the girl who made blackberry smoothies for a sister who didn't care about her. I was the CEO of a firm that could decide the fate of entire corporations with a single keystroke. The contrast between my reality and the life I left behind in Chicago was a gap that could no longer be bridged by blood or history. While my parents were busy maintaining the illusion of their status, mortgage by mortgage and lie by lie, I was building a reality that was unshakable because it was built on the truth of my own worth. I had learned that family isn't the people who try to trap you in a life of service. Family is the strength you find in yourself when the doors are slammed in your face. My father's nuclear strike had been a failure because he underestimated the density of the daughter he had tried to crush. He thought a scholarship was just a piece of paper, but to me, it was a weapon, and I had spent 4 years in the trenches of Boston sharpening it until it was ready to be turned back toward the house on Shoreline Drive. As I sat in my office at Vanguard, looking out at the city that had once felt like a threat and now felt like a playground, I realized that the greatest predictive model I had ever built was the one that told me I was going to win. The $12.5 million they were currently begging for was just the interest on the debt they had owed me since the night I walked out at 3:14 a.m. Fast forward 6 years from that cold morning in the West Bridge High Gymnasium, and the world has tilted on its axis in a way that my father, Richard Sterling, would have deemed mathematically impossible during the years he spent treating me like a disposable household appliance. While I was in the trenches of Boston and Manhattan, building Vanguard private equity into a powerhouse that manages over $4 billion in assets, the Sterling family's singular, obsessive investment in my sister Harper finally hit a catastrophic, high-velocity wall. Harper, ever the architect of aesthetics over substance, had transitioned from a failed communications student into the founder of a luxury lifestyle brand called Solstice, which she pitched to my parents as a revolutionary wellness platform, but which was, in reality, a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme built on a foundation of fraudulent credit applications and forged signatures. To Harper, the $95,000 Range Rover and the $4,500 monthly allowance were never enough. She needed the world to see her as a mogul, and she used my father's professional credentials to open lines of credit that were never meant to be repaid. When the federal investigators finally began pulling at the loose threads of her empire, my parents didn't do the logical thing and distance themselves from the criminality. Instead, they doubled down on their golden girl with a blind, religious devotion that eventually bankrupted their entire $2.1 million estate. They liquidated the $4 million Colonial in Barrington, selling it at a loss during a market dip, just to cover the initial $450,000 in legal fees for a white-collar defense firm that specialized in keeping trust fund socialites out of minimum security prisons. They moved into a cramped two-bedroom rental in a part of the suburbs they used to mock, watching as their retirement accounts and their social standing evaporated into the ozone. This past Tuesday, the cycle of their desperation brought them to the glass and steel headquarters of Vanguard Private Equity on the 52nd floor of One Vanderbilt in Manhattan, a building that represents the absolute pinnacle of global financial power. They had secured an emergency pitch meeting through a third-party consultant, a desperate last-ditch effort to find a firm willing to provide a $12.5 million bridge loan to keep Clementine out of a federal indictment for wire fraud. The delicious, freezing irony of the situation was that they had absolutely no idea who owned the firm they were begging for mercy. To them, Vanguard was just a name on a Forbes list, a faceless entity with enough capital to make their nightmare disappear. I watched them on the high-definition security monitors from my private office, a space filled with custom-built walnut furniture and the subtle, expensive scent of leather and high-end air filtration systems. They were sitting in the waiting room, perched on the edge of two designer chairs upholstered in charcoal gray mohair that probably cost more than my first 3 cars combined. My father was wearing a charcoal suit that was noticeably shiny at the elbows, a sign of a man who was trying to maintain the appearance of wealth while the reality was crumbling beneath his feet. My mother, Susan, sat next to him, her hands clutching a designer handbag that was several seasons old, her eyes darting around the lobby with a mixture of awe and terror. I made them wait. I instructed my executive assistant, Marcus, to inform them that I was running behind in a high-stakes closing, and I made them sit in that silence for exactly 45 minutes. That was the precise amount of time I had sat alone at that folding table in the West Bridge High Gym 6 years ago, staring at the empty chairs marked with the reserved family signs while the principal called my name. Every minute they spent staring at the Vanguard logo on the wall was a minute I had spent wondering why I wasn't enough for them, and the symmetry of the moment felt like a physical weight being lifted off my shoulders. The lobby of Vanguard is a masterpiece of modern corporate architecture, designed to make the visitor feel small and the institution feel eternal. And I watched as my father's confidence slowly eroded with every passing second of my silence. He kept checking his watch, a luxury brand he had likely kept while selling off his other assets, and whispering to my mother, who looked like she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. They were surrounded by the sounds of a thriving, multi-billion-dollar machine, the soft click of keyboards, the hushed tones of analysts discussing 10-figure mergers, and the distant, constant hum of the city that I had conquered while they were busy pampering a criminal. They didn't see the irony in their presence. They only saw a lifeline. They didn't know that the CEO they were waiting for was the same girl who used to scrub their grout with a toothbrush and blend smoothies for a sister who was currently facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. To them, I was still the ghost in the attic, a faded memory of a girl who had disappeared into the Boston fog 6 years ago and was never heard from again. When the 45th minute finally ticked over on my digital clock, I stood up and smoothed the front of my $3,000 custom-tailored navy blazer, feeling the cold weight of my Patek Philippe watch against my wrist. I didn't feel the nervous fluttering I used to feel in their presence. I felt a clinical, detached curiosity, the way a scientist might look at a specimen under a microscope. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the executive suite, my heels clicking against the polished basalt floors with a sound that echoed the authority I had earned through sheer, unadulterated grit. I signaled to Marcus to open the doors, and I stepped into the lobby just as my father was standing up to complain about the wait. The look on his face when he saw me was not one of recognition at first. He saw a powerful, young executive in a high-end office, and his instinct was to offer a professional smile and an outstretched hand. It took exactly 3 seconds for the realization to hit him, for the features of his face to collapse as he connected the girl he had sabotaged at MIT with the woman who now held his entire financial future in her hands. The silence that followed was far more profound than the one in the gym, because this time it was filled with the deafening roar of 1,000 missed opportunities and 100 different betrayals. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked at me, her eyes widening as she took in the luxury of my surroundings and the sheer, undeniable success of the daughter she had erased from her Instagram feed. Richard's hand dropped to his side, his fingers trembling as he struggled to find the words that could bridge a 6-year canyon of neglect. He didn't say my name. He didn't even say hello. He just stared at me as if I were a phantom, a glitch in the hyper-real world he had spent his life trying to curate. I stood there, framed by the floor-to-ceiling windows that showed the sprawling expanse of Manhattan, and I didn't offer a smile or a seat. I just looked at the man who told me I was nothing without him, and I saw a man who was now quite literally nothing without me. The technical details of the Solstice collapse were laid out in the manila folder my father was clutching, a pathetic collection of balance sheets and legal filings that documented Harper's descent from a golden girl into a common fraudster. I knew every number in that folder before he even opened it. I knew that the $12.5 million they needed was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the interest on their various high-risk loans was accruing at a rate that would consume whatever was left of their dignity by the end of the fiscal quarter. I looked at the folder, and then I looked at my mother, who was now weeping silently, the expensive mascara she had applied that morning beginning to streak down her cheeks. I remembered the text message she had sent me about the blackberry smoothie, the one that had been my final incentive to leave, and I realized that the woman standing before me was just a hollow shell of the person who had once wielded so much power over my self-worth. The Sterling family's investment in Harper had failed because it was built on a lie, a belief that aesthetics and favoritism could replace the hard, cold reality of competence and character. They had sacrificed their only viable asset, the daughter who actually understood the math, to protect a girl who didn't even understand the concept of a fiduciary duty. Now, they were standing in the heart of my empire, asking me to use the wealth I had built in spite of them to save the sister who had been the instrument of my torture. It was a request so audacious that it bordered on the surreal, a final testament to the narcissism that had defined their parenting. They didn't want a daughter. They wanted a bailout. They didn't want a relationship. They wanted a wire transfer. And as I stood there in the quiet luxury of the Vanguard lobby, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the money or the title or the office. The victory was the fact that I no longer needed their recognition to know exactly what I was worth. Family isn't the people who share your blood while actively working to dismantle your future. Family is the people who show up when there is no benefit to them, the people who sit in the empty chairs when the world is watching. My parents had left those chairs empty 6 years ago, and in doing so, they had forfeited their right to a seat at my table today. I looked at my father, whose mouth was hanging slightly open as he tried to reconcile the CEO of Vanguard with the maid from Shoreline Drive, and I felt a sense of closure that no amount of therapy or time could have provided. The 45 minutes they spent waiting in my lobby was the last debt they owed me, and the $12.5 million they were about to ask for was a price I was never going to pay. I didn't need to scream or yell or lecture them on their failures. The reality of the room said everything that needed to be said. I was Daisy Sterling, and I was the only person in that lobby who wasn't currently standing on a sinking ship. The heavy oak and tempered glass doors of the primary executive suite swung open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing a space that was designed to intimidate even the most seasoned Wall Street veterans. I was already seated at the head of a $30,000 custom-etched glass conference table that seemed to float above the basalt floors, a piece of furniture so vast and transparent that it left nowhere for a lie to hide. I was wearing a $2,800 charcoal gray wool and silk blend tailored suit from a boutique on Madison Avenue, the fabric shimmering slightly under the recessed LED gallery lighting of the Vanguard headquarters. As my parents walked into the room, the contrast between the world I had built and the one they had destroyed was almost physical. Richard Sterling looked like he had aged 20 years in the 6 years since I'd left. The sharp, predatory edge of his posture had been replaced by a defeated slump, and I noticed immediately that his signature Breitling Navitimer watch was missing from his wrist, likely pawned at a high-end shop in the Diamond District to cover another month of Harper's astronomical legal retainers. Susan followed him like a shadow, her face a map of exhaustion and poorly concealed panic, her eyes darting from the high-tech Bloomberg terminals on the wall to the woman sitting before them. "Daisy," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and a desperate, sickening hope that I didn't recognize. I didn't rise to greet them, nor did I offer them a seat or a glass of the chilled Fiji water that sat in a crystal carafe on the sideboard. I simply sat there in the absolute silence of my success, my hands folded atop a thick manila folder that contained the structural remains of their dignity. I opened the folder with a slow, deliberate movement, the sound of the sliding paper echoing in the vaulted room like a gavel. Inside were the documents my private investigators had spent the last 72 hours compiling, the 84-page federal indictment against Harper for wire fraud and money laundering, and the bright yellow foreclosure notice for the modest rental property in Illinois they had recently failed to secure. "You need exactly $12.5 million by the close of business this Friday to settle Harper's primary fraud charges and prevent the immediate seizure of your remaining assets, including the house you are currently living in," I said, my voice coming out as cold and biting as a January wind off Lake Michigan. I spoke with the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis, because in the world of high-stakes private equity, there is no room for the sentimentality that they had used to blind themselves to Harper's criminality. I leaned forward, the glass table cool against my forearms, and began to lay out the internal audit I had performed on the Sterling family finances, a ledger of waste that spanned the better part of a decade. The numbers don't lie, Richard, and unlike the forged credit applications Harper submitted to 3 different mid-tier banks, these figures represent the absolute reality of your failure as a fiduciary and a father. According to the bank statements I've acquired, you spent $1.2 million on Harper's delusions over the last 6 years alone, funding a lifestyle brand that produced 0 revenue and $300,000 in unreturned inventory. You paid for her private retreats to Sedona, her $95,000 Range Rover, her monthly $4,500 allowance, and even the $400 per hour branding consultants who told her she was a visionary while she was busy stealing from your own clients' escrow accounts. That is a negative 100% return on investment, a figure that would get any junior analyst at Vanguard fired within 10 minutes of their first quarterly review. I watched as my father's face turned a mottled shade of gray, his eyes fixed on the line items I was pointing to with the tip of a $500 Montblanc fountain pen. He had spent his life lecturing me on the importance of fiscal responsibility while I scrubbed his floors, yet he had allowed his favorite child to burn through his entire retirement fund to maintain an aesthetic of success that was as hollow as his own heart. The room seemed to shrink around them as I continued to dissect the carcass of their wealth, detailing the exact moment they had crossed the line from being supportive parents to being unwitting accomplices in a federal crime. Susan began to cry again, the sound a soft, pathetic whimpering that I found I had no emotional response to. I remembered too clearly the way she had asked for a blackberry smoothie while I was packing my life into a $40 duffel bag. There was no water for her here, just the hard, transparent truth of the glass table and the crushing weight of the $12.5 million debt they could never hope to repay. I reminded them of the signing day in the gym, the empty chairs that had cost me my childhood, and I explained that in my world, every debt eventually comes due with interest. You didn't just sabotage my scholarship to MIT, I told Richard. You tried to bankrupt my soul because you couldn't stand the idea of an independent adult who didn't owe you anything. Now you've reached the logical conclusion of that philosophy. You're standing in an office you could never afford, asking for money from a daughter you tried to orphan, to save a child who has spent her life treating you like a personal ATM. The technical precision of my presentation left no room for the excuses they had undoubtedly rehearsed in the elevator on the way up. I showed them the correspondence between Harper and her co-conspirators, the emails where she laughed about how easy it was to manipulate her dad into signing the guarantee forms for her fraudulent loans. I saw my father's hands start to shake, the realization finally dawning on him that the daughter he had worshipped had viewed him with the same predatory indifference that he had shown me. He wasn't her golden child, he was her mark, and my mother wasn't her protector, she was her alibi. They had built a temple out of lies and blackberry smoothies, and the federal government was currently preparing to bulldoze it to the ground. Richard tried to speak, his throat working as he looked at the $12.5 million figure I had circled in red ink, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had forgotten how to breathe in an atmosphere this thin, this high above the street level where real people worked and bled for their survival. I didn't offer them a way out, and I didn't offer them a seat, because I wanted them to feel the physical exhaustion of their own desperation while they stood in the presence of everything they told me I'd never have. I told them that at Vanguard, we don't invest in distressed assets with no path to recovery, and the Sterling family was the most distressed asset I had ever encountered. Every brand name they had ever used to signal their status, the Range Rover, the Breitling, the designer scarves, had been a payment on a loan of vanity that had finally defaulted. I looked at the manila folder, then at the clock on the wall, noting that we had been in the room for exactly 15 minutes, and I informed them that my time was currently billed at $4,000 an hour for external consultations. The sheer absurdity of the statement seemed to hit Susan like a physical blow, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for a hidden camera or a sign that this was all a cruel joke. But there was no joke. There was only the hyper-real, cold-blooded reality of a daughter who had mastered the very math her father tried to use as a leash. As I sat there, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows illuminating the fine weave of my tailored suit, I felt a sense of clarity that was almost transcendental. I wasn't the girl in the attic anymore, and I wasn't the ghost in the gym. I was the personification of the return on investment that they had refused to believe in. I was the $1.2 million they had saved on my education, transformed into a multi-billion-dollar empire through nothing but my own willpower and the algorithms I had built while eating 99-cent cans of tuna. I looked at the foreclosure notice on the table, the legal document that would officially render them homeless by the end of the month, and I felt nothing but a quiet, analytical satisfaction. They had chosen their golden girl, and now they were going to have to live with the consequences of that choice in a world that doesn't accept excuses as legal tender. Richard finally managed to whisper my name, his voice a broken rasp that barely carried across the glass. "Daisy, please, we had no idea. We just wanted her to succeed." I looked him dead in the eye, the same way I look at a failing CEO before a hostile takeover, and I didn't see a father. I saw a man who had gambled his legacy on a fraud and lost everything, including the daughter who would have actually saved him. Family isn't the people who demand your loyalty while they actively plot your ruin. Family is the people who understand that trust is a currency that must be backed by something more substantial than a last name. My parents had spent their lives inflating the value of the wrong daughter, and now they were facing the inevitable market correction. The numbers were on the table, cold and irrefutable. $12.5 million for a chance at a plea deal, or a lifetime of poverty and shame for the girl who had always been their favorite. I closed the folder, the snap of the paper sounding like a finality, and I prepared to deliver the verdict that had been 6 years in the making. The Sterling household was officially out of capital, and I was the only one in the room with the power to decide if the doors would stay open or if the lights would finally go out on the era of the Golden Girl. The silence in the executive suite was so thick, it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked out of the room by the sheer weight of the technical and emotional debt that had finally come due. Richard Sterling, a man who had once commanded rooms with a roar and treated his daughters like assets to be manipulated or discarded, suddenly reached across the $30,000 glass table, his fingers trembling as he tried to grasp my hand in a gesture of pathetic, hollow desperation. He began to speak about family bonds and the sacred nature of blood, his voice cracking as he invoked the very metaphors he had spent 24 years setting on fire for the sake of his own ego and my sister's vanity. I didn't flinch or pull away. I simply leaned back into my ergonomic leather chair, the $2,800 fabric of my suit jacket remaining perfectly crisp as I reached into the manila folder and pulled out a high-resolution color printout of a screenshot from June 14, 2019. I slid the image across the transparent surface of the table until it rested directly under his desperate, reaching hand, forcing him to look at the smiling selfie my mother had posted from the Gold Coast dentist's office while I was sitting alone in a gymnasium signing my life away to MIT. I looked him directly in his bloodshot eyes and told him with a voice as sharp as a surgical scalpel that I was not his family, nor was I his daughter in any functional sense of the word, because those titles had been revoked the moment he chose a blackberry smoothie over my future. I told him quite clearly that I am a chief executive officer, a woman who deals in the cold reality of acquisitions, liquidations, and returns on investment, and that the emotional currency he was trying to spend had long since been hyperinflated into worthlessness by his own hands. The proposal I laid out next was not an act of mercy, but a clinical restructuring of their remaining existence that prioritized the survival of the assets over the dignity of the individuals who had squandered them. I informed them that Vanguard Private Equity would not be providing a $12.5 million bailout to save their reputation or Harper's freedom, as the predictive models I had built in Boston showed that Harper was a toxic asset with a 0% chance of rehabilitation. Instead, I offered them a predatory buyout of their last remaining property, the modest estate in Illinois that was currently facing a sheriff's sale, and I told them I would purchase the deed for exactly 60 cents on the dollar, which was the absolute market floor for a distressed asset in a forced liquidation. Under the terms of the contract I had drafted, they would be allowed to live in the small guest cottage on the edge of the property, not as owners, but as month-to-month tenants subject to the same strict codes of conduct and maintenance that they had once forced upon me when I was their unpaid maid. Harper would go to federal prison to face the 14 counts of wire fraud and grand larceny she had earned, because I refused to spend a single cent of my hard-earned capital to obstruct the course of justice for a woman who had never known the meaning of a day's work. That was the contract. A binary choice between total, unhoused ruin or a life of quiet, supervised survival in the shadows of the daughter they had tried to bury in an attic 6 years ago. I sat there in my 52nd floor office, the sunlight reflecting off the steel towers of Manhattan, and watched as the reality of their situation finally crushed the last remnants of the Sterling family pride. Richard looked at the silver-plated fountain pen I had placed on the table, the same type of pen I had used to sign my scholarship papers while his chairs were empty. And for a moment, the room was so quiet I could hear the rhythmic thumping of my own heart. I told him to pick up the pen and sign his name, reminding him with a cold, analytical smile that this was the same type of legal finality he had tried to weaponize against me when he refused to sign my FAFSA forms. Just like I had to choose between a life of servitude in Barrington and a future of my own making in Boston, he now had to choose between the total annihilation of his lifestyle and the humiliation of being his daughter's tenant. He didn't look at Susan, and he didn't look at the photo of the dentist's office. He simply reached out with a hand that shook with the weight of 20 years of misplaced favoritism and signed the documents in a total, suffocating silence that felt like the final closing of a tomb. The technical transfer of the property was completed within minutes by my legal team, who were standing by in the adjacent conference room to ensure that every decimal point and every clause was ironclad. I watched as the digital signatures were verified on my secondary monitor, the green light signaling that I now officially owned the roof over my parents' heads, the land they walked on, and the very air they breathed within the confines of that Illinois estate. Susan was weeping, a soft and broken sound that seemed to fill the cracks in the glass table, but I felt no impulse to offer her a tissue or a kind word, because kindness was a luxury they had never seen fit to afford me. I had spent 4 years in Boston living on $40 a week for groceries, wearing thrift store clothes and sleeping on the floor, while they were spending $1.2 million on a daughter who was currently being fitted for a prison jumpsuit. The market had finally corrected itself, and the valuation of the Sterling family had plummeted to its true worth, leaving me as the sole surviving shareholder of a legacy that I had rebuilt from the ash they left behind. I stood up from the table, smoothed the lapels of my tailored suit, and informed them that my assistant would walk them to the elevators, as I had a $400 million acquisition meeting starting in 10 minutes that required my full attention. I didn't offer a goodbye, and I didn't promise to visit them in the guest cottage because the transition from daughter to landlord was now complete and irreversible. I watched them walk toward the oak doors, their shoulders hunched and their heads bowed, looking like two ghosts who had accidentally wandered into a world they no longer understood. They were leaving the 52nd floor of One Vanderbilt, not as parents who had found their daughter, but as tenants who had been spared from the street by the very person they had labeled as nothing. I returned to my desk and looked out at the city, the grid of Manhattan stretching out like a grand mathematical proof of what can be achieved when you stop waiting for the people who are supposed to love you to actually do their jobs. The house in Barrington is now just another line item on the Vanguard balance sheet, a small piece of residential real estate that serves as a permanent reminder of the night I walked out at 3:14 a.m. with a $40 duffel bag. I pay the property taxes, I oversee the landscaping fees, and I ensure that the guest cottage is maintained to the basic standards of the local zoning boards. But I never call to check in on the people who live there. I know that Harper is currently serving her 6-year sentence in a minimum security facility in West Virginia, and I know that Richard spends his days sitting on the small porch of the cottage, watching the professional mowers I hire do the work he once made me do by hand. They live in a world of silence now, a silence they built with every missed signing day and every neglected achievement, and I live in a world of sound and fury and unprecedented success. My name is Daisy Sterling, and I have learned that the only thing more powerful than a family bond is a predictive algorithm that tells you exactly when to walk away from a losing investment. The true moral of the Sterling family saga isn't about revenge, although the cold satisfaction of ownership is undeniable. It is about the fundamental law of energy and effort. You cannot spend 20 years draining the life out of one child to inflate the ego of another and expect the universe to maintain its balance indefinitely. Eventually, the child who was forced to grow in the dark will find a way to reach the light, and when she does, she will be stronger, faster, and far more calculated than the ones who were raised in the sun. Family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, nor is it the name on a piece of Italian marble in a kitchen you no longer own. Family is the collection of people who are willing to sign their names to your success when there is nothing in it for them. My parents failed that test 6 years ago, and today they are living with the consequences of a contract they signed in the gym without even being present. As I prepare for my next meeting, I look at the small black notebook I still keep in my desk drawer, the one with the hidden floorboard dust still on its cover, and I realized that every struggle was a preparation for this moment of absolute autonomy. The $12.5 million was never about the money. It was about the power to say no to the people who never said yes to me. I own their roof, I own their peace of mind, and I own the narrative of my own life, a narrative that no longer includes the word daughter unless it is followed by the word CEO. The Sterling household is gone, replaced by the Vanguard institution, and the ghost in the attic has finally become the master of the house. I have chosen my future over my toxic blood, and in the hyper-real world of Manhattan private equity, that is the only choice that ever really mattered.